Good morning, everybody. Last lesson, we just finished up talking about the endocrine system and talking about various hormones, components of the endocrine system. And that kind of leads directly into the reproductive and development. We're going to focus on a number of hormones that are involved with kind of reproduction and development. So let's get started. We'll start with kind of looking at male reproductive structures, female reproductive structures, and then we'll go into a couple processes that take place during reproduction and development. So kind of starting with male reproductive structures. So key structures you have testes. Testes are where sperm are produced, and technically sperm are produced in a structure of the testes known as the epididymis. Once sperm are produced there, they mature in a region in the testes known as the seminiferous tubules. Connecting the epididymis seminiferous tubules to the urethra is a tube-like structure known as the vas deferens. So that delivers mature sperm. Prostate gland is one of a few glands. I'll highlight a couple other ones. But the gland produces the fluid component of semen, which is really kind of gives sperm both protection and nutrients. Urethra is the tube that allows for both semen and for urine to be passed, and that structure travels through the male reproductive organ, which is the penis. With the production of sperm, we know it's known as spermatogenesis. We talked about this back in like chapter 10, where we were talking about mitosis and meiosis. So spermatogenesis is the production of sperm, and the female process would be oogenesis, the production of the gamete eggs. So kind of look at the structures here, just kind of focusing on some key things. So here is your epididymis, right? This whole thing of your testes, and located in here are the seminiferous tubules. Again, I kind of focused on a couple glands. There's the bulbourethral gland, which is kind of blocked right here, the prostate gland, and the seminal vesicle, and they're all involved with carrying kind of the fluid components to semen. Okay. Talk about the female reproductive system, which we'll focus more on. Kind of key structures, you have ovaries, and those ovaries are loosely connected, not fully connected to fallopian tubes. Fallopian tubes also become known as oviducts, kind of interchangeable terms. Uterus is where if a baby is developing, typically the baby is developing in the wall of the uterus, which is known as the endometrium. The opening to the uterus is known as the cervix, and then the birth canal is known as the vagina. Again, kind of going through these key structures, we'll highlight these as we go through some various processes. Key thing is inside the ovaries here, there are regions where eggs mature and eggs develop, and those regions are known as follicles, which is highlighted in a second. So you can kind of see here, right, here's the uterus, and the lining of the uterus is the endometrium here. The cervix is the opening, birth canal. And again, I kind of highlighted, so here are the ovaries, one on either side. That's where the eggs will mature and develop inside follicles in there. And then here are the fallopian tubes or the oviducts. And I kind of said they're loosely attached. They're kind of just in close proximity to each other. Okay, so key thing here is we talk about a follicle, and so we're looking at a picture of an ovary, and a follicle is just a region of active tissue, tissue that can give a lot of nutrients and blood flow, which is needed for a developing egg, right? So here's a follicle here, and inside that follicle is where you'll have an egg kind of mature for ovulation. And ovulation is simply the process of an egg being released, and being released from the follicle, released from the ovaries into the oviduct fallopian tubes. And at that point, that egg is ready for fertilization. Kind of go through the fertilization process, and then we'll kind of jump back in a second. So fertilization is just the process of going from two gametes which are haploid, and to a single zygote, which would be a diploid cell, a 2N cell. Right, so you can see we have our gamete here, which is our egg. Right, we have our sperm. We kind of learned about this before. Right, sperm really just kind of give one thing. They give genetic material, a nucleus. All the other components, genetic material, and all the other components are already located inside the egg. Hence, it's much larger because it has mitochondria and all the organelles necessary for development. Okay, so in this process of fertilization, we have this process known as an acrosomal reaction. And it's just kind of a reaction which I'll highlight in the image next, where it's what takes place as that sperm is trying to enter the egg. And it involves a region of, or kind of a vesicle of enzymes known as the acrosome. So I'll kind of show it to you here. So here's the sperm that's trying to enter the egg, and you kind of see there's a jelly coat here, and then there's these receptors that sperm needs to bind to. Now, once that sperm binds to receptors, all the sperm is doing is allowing its nucleus to enter. But in that process, it needs to kind of get through that jelly coat, and that's where this acrosome takes place. This is a bunch of hydrolytic enzymes. Hydrolytic, right? Hydrolysis just means enzymes that digest, break things down. So it digests the jelly-like structure, giving that sperm access to the receptors. Once it binds to receptors, it can gain access to allow the nucleus, the DNA to enter the cell, the egg. And once that happens, fertilization is taking place. One thing we want to make sure is, we want to be organisms to be 2N, right? We don't want them to be 3N or 4N or have extra genetic material. We've kind of learned that before. So it's very important that when this takes place, though, only one sperm can fertilize the egg. We don't want polyspermy. The organism would not develop normally. In fact, it probably wouldn't develop. So what gets coupled along with this is a cortical reaction. So you can kind of see here, as soon as that nucleus is entering the egg, there's these little cortical granules. It involves kind of calcium, kind of activating these granules to open up. The granules just release all these enzymes and proteins, and it really causes the outer layer of the egg to pull away. And once you can see it pull away, the receptors are released, and it prevents another sperm from trying to get into the egg. And it happens over a matter of like a minute. Like, it's a very, very fast reaction that ensures the avoidance of polyspermy, of an egg being fertilized twice. Okay, so going back to the female reproductive structure, just going to highlight where fertilization typically takes place. So the mature egg is released from the ovaries here. And we're released from the ovaries, they start to kind of travel into the fallopian tubes. And for the most part, fertilization is going to take place at some point as it's traveling down these fallopian tubes, where sperm will meet up with the egg. Okay. Now, this is kind of a key thing, especially if you're looking for SAT2s. This is a graph that you'll often see, kind of looking at the menstrual cycle, but looking at the hormones of the menstrual cycle. Okay, this is, in a sense, kind of it is not a negative feedback system; it's a positive feedback system, right? It's a system that it keeps repeating, but the lining of the uterus will mature and then will be released, and that's what menstruation is. So when we look at this, we look at kind of 4 key things all happening at the same time on the same timeline. So let me just move this up here. All right, so you can kind of see we have our about 28-day cycle. That's about the timeline of a typical menstrual cycle. There's menstruation, which is the release of the lining of the uterus. We have a follicular phase, we have ovulation, which is kind of hidden, but it's right here, and then we have the luteal phase. We have these 4 key phases of the menstrual cycle. What we kind of look at is we look at each stage, but we look at what's happening in different regions. So here are 2 hormones being highlighted. We have FSH and LH. FSH, we kind of mentioned it before last class, is follicle stimulating hormone. It's a tropic hormone because it's stimulating the follicle, and the follicle is a gland of the endocrine system as well. And it's a hormone that's released from the anterior pituitary gland. So both FSH and luteinizing hormone, LH, are both released from the anterior pituitary gland, which is kind of highlighted right here. Now, their target cells are the follicles, the developing follicles, where the developing egg is located inside the ovary. So you kind of see here, right, we have increasing luteinizing hormone, we have slightly increased levels of kind of see here of follicle stimulating hormone, right? This follicle stimulating hormone is really causing the stimulation of a follicle for the development of that egg. You can see a major spike around day 14. Day 14 is, if you kind of go on a 28-day cycle, is about the day of the cycle where an egg is ovulated, right? It is released. And you can see that spike of luteinizing hormone really goes along with ovulation. So you can kind of follow that there. Now, once this is done, the luteinizing hormone drops a little bit, FSH drops a little bit, but they're still kind of stimulating the follicle of the ovary. Okay. Following the same track, you can see here, right? The egg is developing, ovulation. Now, once ovulation takes place, that follicle still plays a very important role. It doesn't just disintegrate. It actually becomes this structure known as the corpus luteum. And it's given a name, right? Because it's an important structure, because this follicle itself becomes a gland of the endocrine system. It starts to secrete its own hormones. So as you see this follicle developing, you can see the rise in another hormone known as estrogen. Probably heard of estrogen before, right? Estrogen is released from the follicle itself, right? You can see it spikes just before ovulation takes place. And what estrogen does is estrogen targets the cells of the uterus. It targets the endometrium. So it causes a buildup of the wall or the lining of the endometrium. Now, why is that important? Well, if fertilization does take place, the endometrium needs to be prepared to have an embryo embed in the lining of the endometrium. So there needs to be additional blood flow and nutrients available for a developing embryo, so that the lining of the uterus is thickening and it's developing. It's being prepared for implantation of a fertilized egg, of an embryo. So estrogen helps to kind of build up that endometrium. Progesterone is also being secreted from the corpus luteum and the developing follicle. Those levels rise as well. And they stay high until the end of the menstrual cycle. If fertilization takes place, the endometrium will continue to get nutrients, right, to help that developing egg. If fertilization doesn't take place in the cycle, in about that 28-day cycle, that's when the endometrium is released. And that's what menstruation is. It's released and the cycle starts over again. Okay. So this is a key one, especially SAT2s. You'll definitely see this on the SAT2s quite often. Okay. So now focusing on what happens if fertilization does take place. Well, we have this monoploid egg, right? So a haploid egg, N, is released. Fertilization usually occurs in the upper region of the fallopian tube. We highlighted that before. And that first cell that's been fertilized is known as a zygote. So it's a fertilized egg. Now, once that happens, we go into a number of stages. The first stage is cleavage, or phases, or stages. I'll call them phases. We go into cleavage phase. And cleavage is exactly what it sounds like. It's just cells dividing into two. And this is a very rapid state of cellular division. So you go from one zygote cell to 2 cells to 4 cells to 8 cells, and it kind of goes through these structures. A morula is kind of like a solid ball of cells. I'll show you a picture in a second. And then a blastula is kind of like this hollowed balls of cells. So instead of just having this solid ball, the cells start to grow smaller and smaller and starts to form this ball that's hollowed out. So the cells on the outside is kind of a hollow cavity in the middle. Okay. All of this cleavage phase takes place as that developing zygote is traveling down the fallopian tubes of the oviduct. So cleavage is happening between fertilization, the top region of the oviduct, down to when it gets to the endometrium. Okay. Once it's kind of gone through its cleavage phase, it implants in the lining of the endometrium. And typically this is like 6 to 7 days after fertilization. So fertilization takes about 6 to 7 days to travel down the oviduct, implants in the endometrium. And at that point, we have this blastula structure, and it jumps into this phase that's known as gastrulation, right? So this blastula is going to undergo gastrulation and become what's called a gastrula, which I'll show you pictures in a second. Just bear with me. And gastrulation is the process of specialization. There's some specialization going on as the zygote's dividing into morula and blastula, but once we get the blastula, it really then starts to undergo this dramatic process of specialization, which starts to form its germ layers. We are a triploblastic organism. That's kind of the highest level of specialization. What that means is we have 3 major germ layers. We have our ectoderm, which is on the outside, our mesoderm, which is in the middle, and then our endoderm is on the inside. And just to simplify it real quick, so the endoderm is basically your digestive tract and accessory organs. Your ectoderm is your skin, your nervous system, and like all the connective tissue in between is your mesoderm. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's good enough for now. So what happens with gastrulation is it starts to form those outer, middle, and inner layers, and that process is known as gastrulation. Once you've gone through gastrulation, you have your three major germ layers, your outer, your middle, right, your ectoderm, your mesoderm, your endoderm. At that point, those germ layers start to really develop into organs. So that's organogenesis. So at the end of gastrulation, you really just have this ball of cells with some folds and cavities. At that moment, the different layers, the ectoderm will start developing into the nervous system. It's called neurulation, and so forth. Okay, so here's kind of our zygote here. So these are two separate images, so they don't really go together, right? So here's your zygote undergoing cleavage, right? So this could be kind of like a marula at this point right here. You can kind of see a marula over here, just a solid ball of cells. It starts to keep dividing. You get this solid ball of cells, which is a blastula. Here's a cross section showing that it has a cavity, and then this blastula will implant into the endometrium, and then it'll start to fold inwards. And that's what this gastrulation is. It starts to fold inwards. And really what it's starting to fold, it's starting to form your digestive tract. It's starting to form the mouth on one side, and then would be the anus on the other side, depending if you're deuterostome or protostome. You don't know what that means, but some organisms form mouth first, some organisms form mouth second. So this is the process of gastrulation. When this happens, this region here and the inner part, this is going to become your endoderm. These cells here on the outer part are going to become the ectoderm. And then cells, depending on what type of organism you are, the mesoderm is going to form in this kind of middle region here on either side, or sometimes down in this region down in here, depending on what type of organism you are. So this image is only showing you two. It's showing you the yellow, which is the endoderm, and the blue, which is the ectoderm. The mesoderm is not shown in this image, but I'll show you an image that does have it in a second. And that's kind of the process of development, right? So we went through fertilization, we go through the cleavage phase, we go through the gastrulation phase. This is the mid-gastrulation phase because this needs to contact with the upper region because it needs to form a canal through the middle, right? Hence our digestive tract and so forth. Just kind of key thing, you could read through this, but the ectoderm is the outer region. Here's all the things kind of a component of the ectoderm: mesoderm, endoderm. You don't need to memorize those, but you can read through those on your own. The last part is once you have gastrulation takes place, you can kind of see you have this nice cavity in here. And this image is showing you the three regions. So here's your mesoderm, right? Here's your endoderm, here's your ectoderm on the outside. And this is showing neurulation. So this is just showing the starting point of forming your nervous system. And you can see this region of the ectoderm starts to kind of fold, right? And starts to kind of form this flattened plate. It's known as a neural plate, but it starts to form this flattened plate, keeps folding, forms this tube. And essentially it starts to kind of give rise to your central nervous system and your peripheral nervous system as well. You don't really need to know anything about this one. I won't quiz you on this, but just it's the process of organogenesis specifically to neurulation. It's like that starting point of forming your nervous system. And other processes are going to take place, starting to form muscle or bone, accessory organs, and so forth. Your cells are going to start to differentiate. That is it. I just want to show you one last picture real quick. So here's kind of you don't really need to pay attention to this, but if you're interested, this is what it looks like at the end of gastrulation. You get this kind of tube in the middle. So this is what turns into your digestive tract here with your ectoderm on the outside, your endoderm on the inside, and then your mesoderm in between. And these are just two different ways that happens. Hopefully that helped. It's kind of on reproduction development. If you have any questions, we can talk about it in class. Thanks for listening. Talk to you later.